Karen called the cops when a plane crashed on my ranch, claiming I was disturbing the peace. But that wasn't the worst part. While I'm on my knees in the dirt, cleaning cuts and checking for broken bones on an injured pilot's arm, this psycho in a crisp white HOA polo comes charging onto my property with bright orange garden shears. Does she offer help? Call 911? Hell no. She starts cutting my water hose while I'm trying to treat the guy's injuries, screaming, "Cease this unauthorized activity!" The acrid smell of aviation fuel mixed with the metallic taste of pure rage as water exploded everywhere. There's a twisted Cessna smoking 10 feet away, wing crumpled like aluminum foil, and Karen's waving her precious citation book over an injured man. "Ma'am, you're interfering with emergency property values," she shrieked, kicking over my first aid kit. 5 minutes later, her career was over. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Ever dealt with an HOA this insane? Drop your horror story below. Where are you watching from? Tell me your state. Let me back up 6 months and introduce you to the players in this suburban nightmare. My name's Jake Morrison. I'm 52, retired Air Force mechanic who thought I'd found paradise when I bought this 47-acre ranch outside Millbrook Heights subdivision. This place has history. Inherited it from Uncle Pete, spent 3 years fixing barns and building a workshop for vintage aircraft restoration. My therapy after 20 years of military deadlines. Every morning I sit on the wraparound porch with coffee, listening to meadowlarks singing over the distant rumble of highway traffic. The sweet smell of hay mingles with the sharp bite of motor oil from my workshop, while gravel crunches under my boots like nature's bubble wrap. I live here with Sarah, who's a nurse at County Hospital, and our 17-year-old daughter, Emma. We're the kind of quiet family who waves at neighbors and minds our own business. The weathered red barn creaks like old bones in the wind. It's been here since 1960, back when this was all farmland. Here's the crucial detail. My property sits adjacent to Millbrook Heights HOA community, but is not part of it. My land predates their fancy subdivision by 40 years. When developers built those cookie-cutter McMansions, they had to work around my grandfather's original homestead. Enter the villain, Karen Whitmore. Karen's 49, works as municipal code enforcement for the county, which should have been my first red flag. Moved to Millbrook Heights 2 years ago and immediately started improvement campaigns. Picture this, $450,000 house with lawns so perfect it looks like AstroTurf, white Mercedes SUV that she washes twice weekly, and a clipboard that's basically a body part at this point. Always dressed in pressed khakis and those crisp HOA polo shirts, like she's commanding a suburban militia. The harassment started 18 months ago with my weekend aircraft engine testing. We're talking 3 hours on Saturday mornings tuning vintage engines for restoration projects, normal stuff. But Karen decided this was her personal Vietnam. First came certified letters written in that passive-aggressive corporate speak. "Mr. Morrison, your industrial activities violate community standards and negatively impact property values." Industrial activities? I was adjusting the carburetor on a 1940s Piper Cub. Then she went nuclear, filed noise complaints claiming I was running an unauthorized aircraft repair business. Started parking on the public road with a telephoto lens, documenting everything like some demented private investigator. I'm talking spreadsheets with timestamps, photos of me carrying wrenches, measurements of my workshop dimensions. The first major unfair act happened during last year's 4th of July barbecue. Karen marched onto my property, not the subdivision, my ranch, with 3 county inspectors in tow demanding to inspect my commercial aviation facility. In front of 30 neighbors eating burgers, the humiliation was thick as the smoke from my grill. "Ma'am, this is private agricultural land," I told her, tasting that metallic flavor of controlled rage. "We'll see about that, Mr. Morrison, grandfathered or not. Here's what's crazy. Most neighbors actually like me. I've fixed tractors for free, cleared storm debris, helped jumpstart dead batteries in winter. But Karen's aggressive rule enforcement had turned half the subdivision into a police state. Monthly HOA meetings felt like war crimes tribunals, with Karen's shrill voice bouncing off community center walls like acoustic torture. She'd called county inspectors 47 times in 6 months, trying to get my barn declared unpermitted. Filed bogus setback violation reports that didn't apply to agricultural exemptions. The woman was building a paper fortress of harassment, one spurious complaint at a time. Sarah started joking that Karen probably irons her grass and alphabetizes her spice rack. But the joke died when I realized this wasn't random HOA power tripping. This was targeted, systematic warfare designed to drive me off land my family had owned for decades. What Karen didn't understand was simple. When you declare war on someone's home, you better be prepared for them to fight back. And I was about to get very creative with my counterattack. The real war began when Karen decided my 40-year-old barn was suddenly an illegal structure. Picture this. I'm in my workshop on a Tuesday morning rebuilding a carburetor for a 1952 Cessna, when County Inspector Mike Rodriguez shows up looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The smell of old motor oil mixed with his nervous cologne created this weird industrial perfume that should have warned me what was coming. "Jake, I hate to bother you, but we got another complaint about unpermitted buildings." "Which building, Mike?" "Your barn, the one that's been here since Eisenhower was president." Karen had filed a formal complaint claiming my barn violated current setback requirements and needed immediate demolition. The absurdity hit me like a wrench to the forehead. This woman was trying to tear down a structure that predated most of the trees on her property. But here's what really made my blood boil. Mike sheepishly handed me a manila folder thick as a dictionary. Inside were 47 separate complaints Karen had filed in 6 months. Not just about the barn, my workshop, my gravel driveway, even Emma's chicken coop for her 4-H project. The woman had been carpet bombing the county office with paperwork like she was fighting World War III. "Mike, she's calling you guys every week about something different." "Try every few days," he muttered. "Yesterday it was your mailbox being 2 inches too close to the road." Time for my counterpunch. And I remembered something from my Air Force days about fighting bureaucracy with better bureaucracy. I spent the weekend at the county courthouse, breathing in that distinctive mixture of dusty files and burnt coffee that every government building seems to marinate in. What I found buried in property records from 1963 was pure gold, an agricultural exemption signed by the county commissioner with an official seal that looked like it belonged on the Declaration of Independence. See, back when my grandfather first registered this land, he was smart enough to get agricultural protection. I'd heard older farmers talk about these exemptions at the feed store, how they basically make your property bulletproof against most zoning nonsense, especially when neighborhoods get built around you later. The old-timers always said to keep those papers safe because city folks would try to regulate away your livelihood if you let them. I sent Karen a certified letter with copies of everything: survey documentation, property deed, and that beautiful agricultural exemption. Professional, polite, and completely devastating. The return receipt came back 3 days later, signed in her sharp, angry handwriting that looked like she'd been stabbing the pen. Did this stop Hurricane Karen? Not even close. Her escalation move was pure genius in its stupidity. She organized a concerned neighbors meeting, sending official-looking flyers to every house in Millbrook Heights about the dangerous industrial operation threatening their peaceful community. The anxiety sweat in that community center was so thick you could practically swim through it when 30 people showed up expecting to hear about some chemical plant disaster. Instead, they got Karen's PowerPoint presentation about my Saturday morning aircraft maintenance. I'm talking pie charts showing noise pollution incidents and photographs of me carrying a socket wrench like I was smuggling nuclear material. "We didn't move here to live next to some junkyard operation," Karen proclaimed, laser pointer clicking at a photo of my perfectly organized workshop. Martha Hendricks, the retired school teacher with more common sense than the rest of the subdivision combined, raised her weathered hand. "Karen, dear, isn't his property agricultural land? My late husband always said that ranch predated everything around here." "Grandfathered status can be challenged," Karen snapped, her face turning the color of a fire engine. That's when it hit me like a freight train. Most of these people had no clue what they were supposed to be angry about. They'd expected a legitimate threat and found themselves listening to complaints about the distant purr of a Piper Cub engine on Saturday mornings. But Karen wasn't finished showing her true colors. After the meeting, I heard through Martha that she'd started whispering to newer residents about my unlicensed flight training school, bringing dangerous aircraft over their children's playgrounds. Complete fiction, but enough to worry people who didn't know the difference between a Cessna and a fighter jet. My next counterpunch came from something I'd overheard at the hardware store. Old Frank Mueller, who runs cattle on 200 acres south of town, mentioned how right-to-farm laws had saved his operation when a golf course development tried to shut down his morning feeding routine. I spent an evening Googling agricultural protections and discovered these laws exist specifically to prevent HOA types from harassing legitimate farming activities that were there first. I also filed a formal harassment complaint with the sheriff's department. The satisfying thunk of Deputy Rodriguez's stamp on the official paperwork sounded like justice being served one page at a time. Karen's next move proved she was either completely delusional or dangerously smart. I still haven't figured out which. 3 days after my harassment complaint hit the sheriff's desk, she contacted the Millbrook Gazette about dangerous aviation activities threatening innocent families. The reporter, a eager young guy named Brad who probably thought he'd stumbled onto the next Watergate scandal, called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was elbow-deep in a carburetor rebuild. "Mr. Morrison, I'm investigating reports of unauthorized flight training operations near residential areas. Any comment?" Here's the mini twist that nearly made me drop my socket wrench. Karen had spun this elaborate fiction about me running a commercial flight school without proper licensing, bringing student pilots over suburban rooftops in death-trap aircraft. She'd even provided evidence. Telephoto shots of my friend Chuck Williams landing his crop duster for routine maintenance, cropped to look like some kind of clandestine operation. The metallic taste of pure disbelief filled my mouth as I processed her audacity. "Son, why don't you drive out here and see what we're actually dealing with?" Brad showed up Friday morning expecting to find some rogue Top Gun Academy buzzing soccer moms in minivans. Instead, he found me installing new spark plugs in a 1946 Aeronca Champ that moves about as fast as a riding lawnmower. The kids spent 2 hours examining my workshop, which looks more like the Smithsonian than a flight school, asking increasingly embarrassed questions. "This is just vintage restoration," he said, the disappointment dripping from his voice like oil from an old engine. "Exactly what I told the lady who called you." The resulting article was 8 sentences buried on page 6. Local resident restores historic aircraft. No mention of flight schools, safety violations, or aerial terrorism. Karen's publicity stunt had crashed and burned worse than Amelia Earhart. But Hurricane Karen was just warming up. Her next escalation was pure desperation wrapped in federal bureaucracy. She filed a complaint with the Federal Aviation Administration claiming I was conducting unauthorized commercial flight training without proper certification. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. This woman knew less about aviation than my teenage daughter. I discovered this latest assault when Chuck Williams called me, laughing so hard he was practically choking on his own amusement. And here's where the story gets interesting. Chuck isn't just any crop duster pilot. He's a Federal Aviation Administration safety inspector who's been using my airstrip for maintenance visits because my work is better than most certified shops. "Jake, some lunatic filed a federal complaint saying you're running an illegal flight school. She wants us to shut down your dangerous training operations before you kill somebody." The absurdity hit me like a brick to the forehead. "Chuck, you've been landing here for 3 years. Have you ever seen me train anybody? Hell, I've been trying to talk you into aerobatics lessons and you keep telling me you're too old for that nonsense." My counterpunch this time was military precision meets bureaucratic warfare. 20 years in the Air Force teaches you that when someone attacks with paperwork, you respond with better paperwork. I gathered every document that proved my legitimacy. Aircraft registrations, airworthiness certificates, insurance policies, maintenance logs going back 15 years, even my dusty private pilot license from 1987. Chuck's official investigation took exactly 45 minutes and involved him drinking coffee on my porch while reviewing documents he'd seen dozens of times. The crisp snap of his clipboard closing sounded like a judge's gavel ending Karen's latest delusion. "Your operations are not only legal, they exceed most commercial maintenance standards," he wrote in his official report. "Mr. Morrison represents the gold standard of civilian aircraft restoration. I sent Karen a certified copy of Chuck's federal clearance, along with a polite suggestion that she learn basic aviation law before wasting federal resources. This time, the return receipt came back signed by her husband. Apparently, Karen was unavailable for deliveries." Sarah couldn't stop giggling when I told her. "She probably thinks you have connections with the Pentagon now." But my real counterpunch was pure strategic brilliance. I documented every false report, every bogus investigation, every taxpayer dollar Karen had wasted on her personal crusade, and delivered it all to Deputy Rodriguez in a neat folder that smelled like justice and fresh printer ink. "Jake, I've responded to 31 calls from this woman since New Year's," Tom said, his pen scratching across the official complaint form. "Yesterday she reported you for suspicious aircraft movements at 6 in the morning. It was Chuck arriving for coffee. The beautiful part was discovering Karen's fatal mistake through Martha Hendricks at the post office. While obsessing over destroying me, Karen had been ignoring actual HOA responsibilities. Broken street lights, drainage problems, playground maintenance, all neglected while she played suburban detective. "She's so focused on you, she forgot she works for us," Martha said with that teacher's smile that usually preceded someone getting detention. That's when I realized Karen had painted herself into a corner. She'd declared war on the wrong enemy while her real bosses, the HOA residents, were getting fed up with her performance. Time to introduce her to political reality. Karen's next move crossed every line between harassment and outright stalking, and frankly, it scared the hell out of my family. It started on a Saturday morning in late September. I was rebuilding the fuel pump on a 1948 Stinson Voyager when movement in my peripheral vision made me look up. There was Karen, crouched behind the cedar windbreak like some demented wildlife photographer, aiming a telephoto lens at my workshop window. The woman was literally hiding in the bushes photographing me working on my own property. I grabbed my phone and started recording her amateur spy operation. The dry crunch of autumn leaves under her feet sounded like breaking glass in the morning stillness. She was so focused on getting her gotcha shots that she didn't notice me documenting her through the window, probably thinking she was Nancy Drew solving the case of the dangerous aircraft mechanic. But here's what made my stomach drop. When I reviewed my security footage that evening, I discovered this wasn't her first rodeo. Timestamps showed Karen conducting weekend surveillance missions for 3 solid weeks, cataloging my every move like I was building nuclear weapons instead of restoring antique airplanes. The bitter taste of violation filled my mouth as I watched her measure distances with a tape measure at dawn, photograph my tool arrangements, even document which aircraft Chuck Williams flew during his maintenance visits. My counterpunch was military-grade escalation. I installed high-definition security cameras with infrared capability around my entire property perimeter. The satisfying weight of professional surveillance equipment in my hands felt like arming for battle. Every corner, every approach, every hiding spot now under digital protection that could read a serial number from 200 yards. Then I called my old Air Force buddy Marcus, who'd gone into private security after retirement. Turns out, Karen's behavior had crossed into criminal territory. What lawyers call stalking by continuous surveillance. In our state, repeatedly photographing someone on private property constitutes harassment, especially combined with her pattern of false official reports. I compiled 3 weeks of Karen's greatest hits, lurking behind trees, measuring my buildings, photographing my aircraft with military precision. The DVD I burned for Deputy Rodriguez was labeled "Evidence of Criminal Stalking" in my neatest handwriting. "Jesus, Jake," Tom muttered, watching Karen's weekend safari adventures on his computer. "Look at this timestamp, 5:15 a.m. on a Sunday, and she's out there with a ruler measuring your fence posts. This woman needs professional help." But Karen wasn't finished proving her complete break from reality. Her next escalation was bringing county code enforcement directly to my doorstep. I watched from my kitchen window as she led some poor inspector in a county truck right up to my property line, gesturing dramatically at my buildings like she was conducting a military briefing. "That workshop violates residential construction codes." Her shrill voice carried across the pasture, sharp enough to make the cattle look up from grazing. "Ma'am, this is agricultural property," the inspector replied, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "These structures are grandfathered under farm exemptions." "Agricultural status can be revoked," Karen snapped. The inspector climbed back in his truck and drove away while Karen was still lecturing empty air about property values and community standards. I later learned his office had implemented a Karen protocol requiring supervisor approval before responding to any calls from Millbrook Heights. My counterpunch this time targeted her professional life with surgical precision. Through courthouse research, I discovered that county employees are bound by strict ethics policies prohibiting use of official position for personal harassment. Every false report Karen filed using her code enforcement credentials was a potential fireable offense and criminal violation. I assembled a comprehensive case file. 47 documented false reports, evidence of surveillance activities, attempts to intimidate neighbors using county resources, and proof she'd been conducting personal vendettas on taxpayer time. The package went to her supervisor, the county ethics board, and the district attorney simultaneously. But the real game changer came through Chuck Williams that Tuesday evening. Jake, your stalker just made the mistake of her lifetime, Chuck said, his voice tight with professional anger. She filed an FAA complaint claiming I was conducting illegal flight training on your strip. Used my full name, license number, everything. What's the big deal? You've dealt with crazy complaints before. Not like this. She specifically accused a federal aviation inspector of violating federal regulations I'm trained to enforce. That's not harassment anymore. That's obstruction of federal operations and filing false federal reports. Both felonies. The sweet smell of justice mixed with the aroma of Sarah's dinner cooking as Chuck explained how Karen had just committed career suicide. By targeting a federal inspector with false accusations, she'd crossed from local nuisance into federal criminal territory. Chuck, please tell me this has consequences. Federal prosecutors already opened a case. They don't appreciate civilians wasting federal resources on personal vendettas. Your neighbor just painted a federal target on her back. Karen had finally declared war on someone with the power to destroy her completely, and she had no idea what was coming. 6. Midpoint. Reveal. Target, approximately 600 words. October 15th, 7:42 a.m. The morning that changed everything. I was on my porch with coffee, watching the sunrise paint the pasture gold, when I heard Chuck's Cessna approaching from the east. Nothing unusual. He'd been stopping by every few weeks for maintenance visits since spring. The familiar drone of his Continental engine was actually comforting, like listening to an old friend humming. But something was wrong. The engine wasn't running smooth. Instead of Chuck's usual confident approach, the Cessna was sputtering, coughing like a sick horse. I set down my coffee and watched him fighting to maintain altitude, the aircraft wobbling as he lined up with my grass strip. "Come on, Chuck," I muttered, my stomach nodding with that familiar pre-crash tension from my Air Force days. The engine quit completely about 200 feet out. Chuck's emergency landing was textbook perfect, until his left wing clipped my fence post and sent the Cessna cartwheeling into the pasture. The screech of metal on metal mixed with the crash of splintering wood as the aircraft came to rest nose down, propeller buried in my dirt. I was running before the dust settled, grabbing my first aid kit from the workshop. The acrid smell of aviation fuel and hot oil filled the morning air as I reached the wreckage. Chuck was conscious but dazed, a nasty gash on his forehead bleeding into his eyes. "Chuck, don't move, buddy. I've got you." That's when I heard the voice that made my blood freeze. "What did you do?" Karen Whitmore came charging across my pasture like an avenging angel of suburban justice, still in her bathrobe and slippers, hair wild from sleep. But instead of asking if Chuck was okay, instead of offering help, she was pointing at me like I'd personally shot down his aircraft. "Ma'am, we need to call 911, I said, pressing gauze against Chuck's head wound. "This man needs medical attention." "You staged this!" Karen shrieked, her voice reaching frequencies that could shatter glass. "This is another one of your illegal aviation stunts." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was a man bleeding in front of us, aircraft fuel soaking into my soil, and this woman was accusing me of orchestrating a plane crash for entertainment. But here's where everything went from insane to criminal. Karen pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911, but instead of reporting a medical emergency, she started filing a complaint against me. "Yes, I need to report property damage and illegal aviation activities," she said into the phone, stepping over scattered aircraft parts like they were lawn ornaments. "The neighbor has crashed another aircraft on his property in violation of residential safety codes." Another aircraft? This was Chuck's first emergency landing here ever. "Ma'am, please," Chuck groaned from the ground, blood trickling down his cheek. "I need medical assistance." "Sir, you're trespassing on residential property," Karen snapped at him. "I'm reporting this incident as unauthorized aircraft operations in a residential zone." That's when the revelation hit me like lightning. I was listening to Karen file a false police report during a medical emergency. She was more concerned with pursuing her vendetta against me than helping an injured man. But the real bombshell came when Chuck, despite his head injury, managed to focus on Karen's face. "Lady, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "I don't care if you're the Wright brothers," Karen shot back. "This illegal flight activity ends today." Chuck reached into his shirt pocket with a shaky hand and pulled out his federal identification. "Federal Aviation Administration, Office of Safety Inspections. And you just filed a false emergency report in front of a federal officer." The color drained from Karen's face faster than oil from a cracked engine. "That's a felony, ma'am." And I heard every word. Karen's phone was still connected to 911, broadcasting her lies to emergency dispatch while a federal inspector bled in my dirt. She'd just committed career suicide on a recorded line. The moment that 911 dispatcher heard Chuck identify himself as a federal inspector, everything changed. "Ma'am, are you reporting a medical emergency or filing a complaint?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through Karen's phone speaker, confusion evident even through the static. There's been an aircraft incident," Karen stammered, finally realizing she'd painted herself into a corner on a recorded emergency line. "We're dispatching paramedics and sheriff's deputies. Please stay on the line." The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, followed by Deputy Rodriguez and 2 other officers who took one look at the scene and immediately understood what they were dealing with. While EMTs treated Chuck's head wound, Tom pulled me aside. "Jake, we've got Karen on tape filing false reports during a medical emergency. Chuck's injuries are documented. Her interference with emergency response is on record. This isn't harassment anymore, this is criminal obstruction." But Chuck, even with a bandaged head, was thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. "Jake, I need you to understand something," he said from the back of the ambulance, his federal inspector credentials still clutched in his hand. "This woman has been filing false reports about federal aviation activities for months. She's wasted hundreds of hours of federal investigative time with spurious complaints. That's not just a local crime, that's federal obstruction." The first ally was obvious. Chuck himself, a federal aviation inspector with 18 months of documented harassment from Karen. His testimony would carry the weight of federal law enforcement. The second ally surprised me. Martha Hendricks approached while the EMTs were loading Chuck into the ambulance. "Jake, I've been documenting Karen's behavior at HOA meetings for 6 months, she said quietly, pulling a manila folder from her sensible handbag. "Meeting minutes, financial records, resident complaints. She's been using HOA funds to pay for private investigators to watch you. That's embezzlement." Martha's teacher instincts had kicked in the moment Karen started her campaign against me. She'd been taking detailed notes, keeping copies of everything, building a case without even realizing it. The third ally was Deputy Rodriguez himself. "Jake, I've responded to 63 calls from Karen Whitmore in the past year. 63. Most departments consider more than 10 complaints from the same person a pattern of abuse. I've been building a file on her for months." But the real strategic breakthrough came from Sarah, who'd been quietly researching while the rest of us dealt with the immediate crisis. "Honey, I found something important," she said that evening, spreading printouts across our kitchen table that smelled like fresh ink and determination. "Karen's been violating county ethics policies since day one. Code enforcement officers can't use their position for personal disputes. Every report she filed using her county credentials was a fireable offense." The legal strategy crystallized like morning frost on my workshop windows. First, the federal angle. Chuck would file charges for obstruction of federal aviation operations, false reporting to federal agencies, and interference with emergency response involving a federal officer. Federal prosecutors don't mess around with people who waste their resources. Second, the state criminal charges, filing false police reports during emergencies, criminal harassment through continuous surveillance, and obstruction of emergency medical services. Tom Rodriguez had enough evidence to support all 3 charges. Third, the civil lawsuit, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, interference with use and enjoyment of property, and attorney's fees. I documented everything, every false report, every hour of lost work, every dollar spent defending against her spurious complaints. Fourth, the employment consequences. County ethics violations, misuse of official position, harassment of private citizens using government authority. Sarah had researched the county employee handbook cover to cover. Karen had violated at least 8 separate policies. But the nuclear option came from Martha's HOA research. "Jake, she's been embezzling community funds," Martha explained, her teacher's precision making every word count. $4,200 in unauthorized payments to a private investigator, legal fees for personal disputes, and administrative costs for pursuing individual vendettas. That money came from resident assessments meant for community maintenance. The HOA angle was pure genius. While Karen was obsessing over destroying me, she'd been stealing from her own neighbors to fund her crusade. Every resident who'd paid HOA fees had standing to demand restitution. Chuck's federal resources added the final piece. The FAA takes false reporting seriously because it wastes emergency response resources and endangers aviation safety. I can recommend criminal prosecution, but more importantly, I can testify about the pattern of harassment and its impact on legitimate aviation activities. The technical preparation was methodical as aircraft maintenance. I compiled security footage showing 3 months of stalking behavior, documentation of 63 false police reports, evidence of misused county resources, and financial records proving HOA embezzlement. Sarah organized medical documentation of Chuck's injuries, employment records showing Karen's ethics violations, and a timeline connecting her surveillance activities to her filing of false reports. By Thursday evening, we had built a legal arsenal that could destroy Karen's career, finances, and freedom simultaneously. The community was about to learn what happens when someone declares war on the wrong neighbor. Karen's desperation reached new heights when she realized the federal investigation wasn't going away. 3 days after Chuck's crash, I caught her on my security cameras doing something that proved she'd completely lost touch with reality. At 2:47 a.m., she was creeping around the crash site with a flashlight, apparently trying to plant evidence that would support her claims about unauthorized aviation activities. The infrared footage was crystal clear. Karen kneeling in my pasture, arranging what looked like aircraft parts in specific patterns, then photographing them with her phone. The metallic clink of scattered metal pieces sounded like wind chimes in hell as she staged her pathetic crime scene. But here's the mini twist that made my jaw drop. She wasn't just planting evidence. She was stealing actual wreckage from Chuck's aircraft, federal property under investigation by the FAA. The woman had just upgraded from filing false reports to tampering with federal evidence. My silent preparation was methodical as a bombing run. First, I compiled the security footage showing Karen's midnight evidence planting expedition and sent copies to Chuck, Deputy Rodriguez, and the federal prosecutor handling her case. The timestamp evidence was damning. 2:47 a.m. to 3:23 a.m., 36 minutes of documented federal crime. Second, I had my lawyer send formal notice to Karen's employer that their code enforcement officer was under federal criminal investigation for obstruction and evidence tampering. County employees can't maintain security clearance while facing federal charges. Her job was already hanging by a thread. But Karen's next move proved she was either completely delusional or dangerously cunning. She attempted to hack into the HOA's digital meeting records to delete her anti-Jake statements from the past 18 months. The woman apparently thought that erasing the evidence of her harassment campaign would somehow make the federal charges disappear. Unfortunately for Karen, Martha Hendricks had been a school administrator for 30 years and understood the importance of backup systems. Every HOA meeting had been recorded and stored in multiple locations, including Martha's personal cloud storage account that smelled like digital security and old-fashioned competence. That fool tried to delete 6 months of meeting minutes, Martha told me, her teacher's indignation sharp as a ruler crack. But I've got copies of everything, including her budget requests for community security assessments that were actually payments to private investigators watching you. Karen's desperation escalated to pathetic when she showed up at my front door on a Thursday evening, sweating through her usually pristine polo shirt, offering what amounted to a bribe. "Mr. Morrison, I think we can resolve this misunderstanding without involving federal authorities," she said, her voice shaking like autumn leaves in a windstorm. "The HOA board is prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience you may have experienced." The stench of fear sweat mixed with her expensive perfume created this nauseating cocktail that made my porch smell like desperation. "Ma'am, are you offering me money to drop federal criminal charges?" "I'm suggesting we handle this as neighbors," she stammered. "Community dispute resolution. The HOA could pay for fence repairs, workshop improvements, maybe even some aviation equipment upgrades." I was recording the conversation on my phone, perfectly legal on my own property, and Karen had just added attempted bribery to her growing list of federal charges. The woman was digging her grave deeper with every word. "Karen, I'm not the one pressing charges. The federal government doesn't accept HOA payments to drop criminal cases." "But you could ask them to reconsider," she pleaded, sweat now visible on her forehead despite the cool evening air. "Explain that this was all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding? You filed false federal reports, interfered with emergency medical response, tampered with evidence, and just offered me a bribe." Which part was the misunderstanding? Her face crumpled like paper in a fire as the reality of her situation finally penetrated. She'd declared war on someone with federal protection and lost spectacularly. Meanwhile, the professional consequences were cascading like dominoes in an earthquake. Karen's supervisor at County Code Enforcement had placed her on unpaid administrative leave pending the outcome of federal charges. Her security clearance was suspended, her county vehicle confiscated, and her office computer seized as evidence in the ethics investigation. The HOA was conducting its own internal audit that revealed systematic financial mismanagement beyond just the private investigator payments. Karen had been using community funds for personal legal fees, unauthorized office supplies, and administrative costs related to her personal disputes. But the real nail in her professional coffin came from an unexpected source. The County Ethics Board discovered she'd been filing false official reports for over 2 years, not just against me, but against at least 6 other residents who'd crossed her path. This woman has been using her government position as a weapon, County Supervisor Helen Walsh told the local newspaper. We're reviewing every complaint and citation she's issued during her employment to determine how many were legitimate versus personal vendettas. Karen Whitmore's career wasn't just over, it was being publicly autopsied in the court of public opinion, and we hadn't even gotten to the criminal trial yet. Karen's final desperate measures proved that cornered animals are the most dangerous. With her career hanging by a thread and federal charges looming, she made one last-ditch attempt to salvage her reputation by rallying the remaining HOA faithful. The emergency meeting notice she sent out was pure propaganda. Community safety crisis, immediate action required to address ongoing aviation threats. The pathetic scene that unfolded Tuesday evening at the community center would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. Karen had set up a full PowerPoint presentation for what she apparently expected to be a packed auditorium of angry residents demanding my immediate destruction. Instead, exactly 4 people showed up. Martha Hendricks came to document Karen's final meltdown for the official record. 2 newer residents, the Johnsons, arrived expecting to hear about legitimate safety concerns, but left halfway through Karen's rambling presentation about federal aviation conspiracies and coordinated attacks on community values. The 4th attendee was Deputy Rodriguez, who'd been tipped off by Martha that Karen might be planning something desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, her voice echoing off empty chairs in the nearly vacant room, "we are facing an unprecedented threat to our community safety and property values." She clicked through slides showing heavily cropped photos of Chuck's emergency landing, trying to make it look like I was operating some kind of aircraft carrier in my backyard. The metallic click of her presentation clicker sounded like a death rattle in the hollow space. "This incident proves that unauthorized aviation activities must be stopped before someone gets killed," she declared to her audience of 4, sweat visible under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mrs. Johnson raised her hand. "Ma'am, wasn't that an emergency landing?" "The pilot was injured, right?" "That's what they want you to believe," Karen snapped, her composure cracking like cheap plastic. This was a coordinated demonstration designed to intimidate HOA leadership. The Johnsons exchanged glances and quietly left through the back door. Meanwhile, my silent victory preparation was reaching completion across multiple fronts. The federal prosecutor had scheduled Karen's arraignment for the following month on charges of filing false federal reports, obstruction of federal aviation operations, and tampering with evidence under federal investigation. Each charge carried potential prison time and guaranteed employment termination. My civil lawsuit was locked and loaded with 18 months of documented harassment, quantified damages exceeding $15,000 in legal fees and lost work time, and evidence of intentional infliction of emotional distress that would make any jury furious. County administration had completed their ethics investigation and found Karen guilty of 8 separate policy violations, including misuse of official position, harassment of private citizens, and conducting personal business on county time. Her termination paperwork was already drafted, but the HOA nuclear option was the most beautiful piece of strategic warfare I'd ever witnessed. Martha had organized a petition drive that collected signatures from 89% of Millbrook Heights residents demanding Karen's immediate removal as HOA president. The petition included financial documentation of her embezzlement and a demand for full restitution of misused community funds. The community revolt was swift and merciless. Residents who'd been afraid to speak up individually found courage in numbers, sharing their own Karen horror stories that painted a picture of systematic abuse of authority. "She fined me $50 for having the wrong shade of mailbox," resident Tom Casey told the local newspaper. "Then spent HOA money hiring private investigators to spy on a neighbor who was just fixing old airplanes." The media attention exploded like aviation fuel hitting a spark. Local news picked up the story first. HOA president charged with federal crimes after plane crash. But the narrative that emerged was even more devastating than I'd hoped. Karen became the poster child for HOA abuse of power gone completely insane. The security footage of her cutting my water hose during Chuck's emergency went viral on social media, racking up 2 million views and thousands of comments from people sharing their own HOA nightmare stories. Karen's face became a meme representing everything wrong with suburban petty authoritarianism. National HOA reform blogs picked up the story, using Karen as a case study in how unchecked power corrupts even the smallest amount of authority. Legal advocacy groups cited her case as evidence for stronger oversight of community associations. Karen's world was crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Her white Mercedes SUV sat unwashed in her driveway for the first time since I'd known her, newspapers piling up like evidence of her social isolation. Former allies crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Her perfectly manicured lawn started showing brown spots from neglect. The psychological pressure was visible from my security cameras. Karen rarely left her house except for legal appointments, always wearing sunglasses and baseball caps like some kind of suburban fugitive. But the final nail in her coffin was yet to come. The emergency HOA meeting to formally vote on her removal was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and every single resident in Millbrook Heights was planning to attend. Karen's public execution was about to begin, Thursday evening, October 28th. The emergency HOA meeting that would end Karen Whitmore's reign of suburban terror. The Millbrook Heights Community Center hadn't seen this many people since the grand opening. Every resident showed up, plus local media, county supervisors, and a handful of federal investigators who'd driven down from the state capitol. The air was thick with anticipation and the kind of tension you could cut with a chainsaw. Ironic, considering how this whole mess started. Karen arrived 20 minutes late, looking like she'd been sleeping in her car. Her usually pristine appearance was replaced by wrinkled clothes, unwashed hair, and the desperate eyes of someone who knew their world was ending. She clutched a manila folder like it contained nuclear launch codes instead of whatever pathetic defense she'd cobbled together. The meeting was called to order by interim HOA President Martha Hendricks, who commanded the room with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with difficult children, which, let's face it, described most HOA board meetings perfectly. "Before we address tonight's primary business," Martha announced, her voice carrying that teacher's tone that could silence a riot, "we have several guests who'd like to make statements regarding recent events." Deputy Rodriguez went first, reading from an official report that sounded like a criminal indictment. "In the past 18 months, our department has responded to 71 calls from Ms. Whitmore regarding her neighbor Jake Morrison. 71. Our investigation has determined that 68 of these calls were filed in bad faith, constituting criminal harassment and abuse of emergency services." The room erupted in murmurs. 71 calls? Even I hadn't realized the scope of Karen's obsession. Chuck Williams spoke next, his federal credentials giving weight to every word. "As an FAA safety inspector, I can confirm that Ms. Whitmore filed multiple false reports claiming illegal aviation activities. These reports wasted hundreds of hours of federal investigative time and resources. She also interfered with emergency medical response during my aircraft accident, potentially endangering my life." But the moment everyone was waiting for came when I was invited to address the community. I walked to the front of the room, feeling the weight of 130 pairs of eyes watching my every move. Karen sat in the front row, her face pale as printer paper, that manila folder trembling in her hands like a leaf in a tornado. "Neighbors," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, "I'm not here to ask for revenge. I'm here because someone needs to understand the difference between community leadership and personal vendetta." I pulled out my phone and connected it to the community center's sound system. "This is a recording of Karen's 911 call during Chuck's emergency landing. I want you to hear exactly what your HOA president considers appropriate emergency response." The room went dead silent as Karen's voice filled the space. "Yes, I need to report property damage and illegal aviation activities. The neighbor has crashed another aircraft on his property in violation of residential safety codes. Then Chuck's voice, weak from his injuries. Ma'am, I need medical assistance. And Karen's response, Sir, you're trespassing on residential property. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Several residents were visibly shaking their heads, and I saw more than one person mouth the word unbelievable. Karen finally stood up, her folder spilling papers across the floor like confetti at a funeral. You don't understand, she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. He was violating community standards. His activities were affecting our property values. I was protecting this neighborhood. Martha Hendricks stood up with the authority of Moses parting the Red Sea. Miss Whitmore, you were protecting nothing. You were pursuing a personal vendetta using community resources and your county position. You embezzled $4,200 of our money to hire private investigators to stalk a neighbor. The federal investigator in the back row chose that moment to step forward. Ma'am, you're currently under federal indictment for filing false reports and obstruction of federal operations. Anything you say here can and will be used against you in court. Karen's face went from pale to green. She looked around the room desperately, searching for a single sympathetic face and finding none. Motion to remove Karen Whitmore as HOA president, called out resident Tom Casey. Seconded. It came from at least 15 voices simultaneously. The vote was swift and merciless. 127 residents in favor of removal, 0 opposed, 3 abstentions. Karen Whitmore's political career died faster than her credibility. Motion to demand full restitution of embezzled funds, Martha added. Another unanimous vote. The final humiliation came when security was called to escort Karen from the premises. As she was led out, her HOA keys and access cards confiscated publicly, someone in the crowd started clapping. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause, not for her removal, but for the end of her reign of terror. Local news reporter Sandra Martinez approached me as the meeting ended. Mr. Morrison, any comment on tonight's proceedings? Sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to bullies, no matter how official their title sounds. That quote would be repeated on every news station in the state. 3 months later, justice had been served with a side of the sweetest vindication I'd ever tasted. Karen pled guilty to federal charges of filing false reports and obstruction of federal operations, receiving 18 months probation, a $5,000 fine, and 200 hours of community service cleaning roadside litter. The federal judge's comment during sentencing became instant local legend. Miss Whitmore, you wasted more taxpayer resources pursuing a personal vendetta than most actual criminals steal. Her career in county code enforcement died the moment her guilty plea hit the courthouse records. Federal convictions and government security clearances don't play well together. Shocking, I know. The county demanded an additional $12,000 restitution for the investigative time her false reports had wasted. The civil settlement was pure poetry. Karen paid me $8,500 covering legal fees, property damage, and what my lawyer politely called emotional distress compensation. Every dollar went toward workshop improvements and the high-definition security system that now protects my property like digital guardian angels. The HOA restitution added insult to injury. Karen repaid $4,200 in embezzled community funds, plus penalties that brought the total to nearly $6,000. That money finally fixed the streetlights and drainage problems she'd ignored while playing suburban spy games. But the real magic happened in how Millbrook Heights transformed under Martha Hendricks' gentle leadership. The new HOA implemented accountability measures that would make corporate auditors proud. Every complaint requires documentation and peer review. Community funds need board approval for any expenditure over $50. Most importantly, personal vendettas disguised as official business became automatic grounds for removal. Property values jumped 12% in 6 months. Apparently, living somewhere run by reasonable humans instead of petty dictators appeals to homebuyers. Who could have seen that coming? Chuck Williams made a complete recovery and still graces my airstrip every few weeks with his crop duster's familiar engine purr. The difference now is neighbors actually walk over to chat about flying instead of calling federal agencies. Chuck's become a local celebrity since our story went viral, giving aviation safety talks at schools and teaching kids that emergencies bring out either the best or worst in people. My ranch evolved into the unofficial heart of our community. Sarah's monthly barbecues have become legendary. Neighbors bring broken lawnmowers for me to fix while we share war stories about suburban bureaucracy and laugh until our sides hurt. The sound of genuine laughter mixing with the clink of tools and smell of grilling burgers has replaced the tension that used to hang over this place like storm clouds. The Chuck Williams Aviation Safety Scholarship became our proudest achievement. Starting with my settlement money and growing through community donations, we've raised enough to send 6 local kids to flight school and fund emergency response training for 8 others. Last month, scholarship recipient Jenny Martinez became the first female pilot in her family's 3-generation farming operation. Our annual fly-in breakfast has transformed from my crazy idea into a regional tradition. This year, 87 aircraft landed on my grass strip, bringing families from 4 states to celebrate aviation and raise scholarship funds. The irony of Karen's former neighbors now hosting one of the county's largest aviation events wasn't lost on anyone with a functioning sense of humor. The event offers practical education too. First aid certification, aircraft safety demonstrations, and property rights workshops that help people understand their legal protections. Knowledge that could prevent future Karen situations while building stronger communities. Karen's final chapter was predictably pathetic. She fled Millbrook Heights 8 months after her conviction, selling her McMansion for $35,000 below market value because being the neighborhood villain apparently hurts property values more than aircraft restoration ever could. Last anyone heard, she was managing inventory at a big box store 2 counties away, probably alphabetizing products and timing employee bathroom breaks with military precision. The lessons from our suburban warfare are simple but powerful. Document everything with dates and photos, research your property rights thoroughly, attend community meetings and demand transparency, and never let small-minded bullies intimidate you on your own land. As I sit on this same porch where our story began, listening to meadowlarks singing over the distant drone of Chuck's approaching Cessna, breathing in that perfect mixture of hay, coffee, and morning freedom, I can't help but grin. Sometimes David really does beat Goliath, especially when Goliath is a clipboard-wielding suburban tyrant with delusions of authority. Got your own HOA nightmare that makes Karen look reasonable? Share it in the comments. The most outrageous story gets featured next week on Karen Stories. Hit that subscribe button for more justice-served tales where bullies get exactly what they deserve, and let me know where you're watching from. Drop your state and tell us about your worst HOA encounter.